The boots were still there. Laura Bennett's locker door creaked open, and she reached past the pressed scrubs, past the spare stethoscope coiled like a cobra, to touch the leather. Worn. Cracked along the heel. The laces tied with a specific knot she'd taught herself to undo in the dark. 20 years hadn't dulled the muscle memory. Her fingertips traced the edge of the sole, where red dust from Marja had calcified into the grooves, dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove because some things were meant to stay embedded. She closed the locker. 5:47 a.m. 13 minutes before her shift began. The parking lot of St. Michael's Hospital had emptied of the night staff. Rain hammered the asphalt like distant artillery, and Laura moved through it without hurrying, her gait economical, precise. The limp favored her left side but was minimal enough that most people wouldn't notice. The scar tissue beneath her scrub stretched tight as she crossed the threshold into the emergency department, a reminder that bodies healed even when the other parts didn't. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent song. Antiseptic and floor wax. That was Houston's smell at dawn, before the coffee brewed, before the visitors arrived, before the hospital became a machine of noise and need. Laura had learned to love it, the smell of a place where the broken came to be reassembled. She'd rebuilt her own life in these corridors, one shift at a time, one patient at a time, the way you rebuilt a structure after an explosion, one foundation stone, then the next, then the next. No ceremony. No speeches. Just work. The ICU corridors stretched in clean lines. Room for 47 had its curtains drawn. Room for 49 held a post-operative cardiac patient, his monitor beeping a steady rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat amplified through a speaker system. Laura passed the nurse's station, where the night shift supervisor, Marcus, looked up from his charting with the neutral expression of someone who'd worked 12 hours straight. "Morning, Laura. You've got 451, 453, and the new admission coming up from ER in about 20 minutes, he said, sliding a tablet across the counter. 451's the post-trauma from yesterday. Stable, but we're watching his pleural cavity. Chest tubes draining clear, vitals holding. He's been asking for water, but we're NPO pending imaging." Laura took the tablet without comment, her eye scanning the vitals. Heart rate 84. Respiratory rate 18. Blood pressure 128/71. O2 sat 96 on 2 liters. The numbers told her a story, a man healing, cautiously, without complications. For now. "Thanks, Marcus," she said. Her voice was soft, the kind of soft that didn't carry accusation or need or want. Just information moving from one person to another. Marcus nodded, already turning back to his screens. Room for 51 was on the east wing, 3 doors down from the supply closet where the emergency equipment lived in color-coded order. Laura had memorized where everything was on her first day 18 months ago. The 14-gauge angiocath needles in the blue drawer. The 7.0 endotracheal tubes in the cabinet above the sink. The defibrillator pads kept cool in the small refrigerator behind the locked cabinet. Knowledge like that was survival. In the ICU, you didn't hunt for equipment when a patient's O2 was dropping. You knew exactly where it lived. The man in room for 51 was asleep. His chest rose and fell steadily, the breathing comfortable, not labored. A plastic tube ran from his left chest wall to a collection chamber below the bed, the chest tube draining fluid the way it was supposed to. Laura approached with the movements of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, quiet, deliberate, respectful. She didn't wake patients unnecessarily. Trauma did that enough already. His chart said admitted yesterday with blunt force thoracic trauma. Motorcycle accident. No, the notation said. Motor vehicle accident. Single vehicle collision. Extensive bruising across ribs 3 through 7 on the left side. Left pleural effusion. Chest tube placed in the ER. Orthopedics had cleared him, no fractures, just bruising. No head injury. Alert and oriented ×3 when he'd arrived. Good candidate for discharge in 48 hours if the chest tube continued to drain clear. His face was tan, lean, with the kind of jaw that suggested he'd spent time in sun and discipline. A military tattoo marked his right bicep. Laura could see the edge of it below his hospital gown. An anchor. A trident. No, a seal trident. She'd seen enough of those in her life to recognize the insignia without looking directly. She took his vitals without waking him. Temperature 37.2. Blood pressure steady. The monitors beside his bed beeped their monotonous rhythm, no alarms, no distress. A healing patient. That was the best kind. The break room occupied the northwest corner of the ICU floor, a space painted in soothing beige that no one had found soothing since the hospital opened in 2004. The coffee maker gurgled, producing what might have been coffee or might have been a warning. Laura filled a mug anyway, the ceramic warm in her hands. She sat at the small table by the window that looked out onto the parking lot, where rain continued its percussion against the pavement. Sarah Chen, one of the day shift RNs, entered with her phone in one hand and a yogurt in the other. She smiled at Laura with the kind of smile that was polite but not warm. "Morning, Laura. How's the night crew?" "Quiet," Laura said. 451 stable. 447 spiked a temp at 3 a.m. but it came down with the antipyretic. 449's ready for step down. Sarah nodded, settling at the other end of the table. Not at the same table, technically, but at a distance that made conversation possible if she wanted it. She didn't sit next to Laura. Most of the staff didn't. They maintained a perimeter, a professional distance that felt less like neutrality and more like caution. Laura didn't mind. She'd spent enough of her life around people who understood that silence was sometimes the safest language. A moment later, David from the day shift arrived, saw Laura, and turned without speaking, moving to the far end of the room with his breakfast burrito. Then Priya from respiratory therapy, who actually did nod at Laura, set down her coffee, and then left when her phone rang. The break room cycled through bodies, people arriving, taking their coffee, leaving, like a system designed to prevent any prolonged interaction with the quiet nurse in the corner. Laura drank her coffee and watched the rain. What she didn't know was that Dr. Ashford had already noticed her. He'd first seen her 6 weeks ago, working a code in room for 43. His resident was fumbling with an 4, missing the vein for the second time, and Dr. Ashford had been preparing to step in when Laura had simply appeared, said nothing, picked up a tourniquet with one hand while the resident scrambled out of the way, and threaded a 18-gauge angiocath into the patient's basilic vein on the first stick while everyone else was still adjusting their gloves. She'd pushed medications, maintained rhythm, coordinated the compressions with the precision of someone who'd done it before, not once but 100 times. The patient had coded for 17 minutes. He'd been dead, truly dead, the kind of dead where families start saying goodbye. Laura had brought him back. She'd done it without a word. Without a glance at Dr. Ashford. Without any acknowledgement that she'd just demonstrated a level of competence that made his residents look like they were playing hospital. The patient had survived. Transferred to the cardiac unit 3 days later. And Laura had gone back to her regular shifts, checking vitals, charting, moving through the hospital like a ghost. That was what bothered Dr. Ashford. He'd arrived this morning at 6:15 a.m. for his rounds, his white coat pristine, his tablet already loaded with the night shift summaries. He'd reviewed the numbers. For 51 was stable. Unremarkable. For 53 was ready for discharge. Also unremarkable. The post-operative patient in 449 was recovering normally. Every metric was exactly where it should be, which meant there had been no crisis, no emergency, no moment where someone needed to step in and prove themselves indispensable. That was because Laura had been here. He'd moved through the unit with his resident, Dr. Patricia Matthews, who was competent but not brilliant, who would follow protocol and ask questions and become a solid hospitalist if she stayed in Texas. Safe. Manageable. The kind of doctor who understood that the hospital operated on hierarchy, that the attending physician was the authority in the room, that experience and credentials determined who made decisions and who executed them. He'd paused at room for 51, reviewing the chart. The night shift nurse, Laura Bennett, according to the notation, had documented the chest tube drainage, the vitals, the patient's comfort level. The charting was meticulous. The observations were precise. The detail work was perfect. A nurse who disappeared into competence so completely that she became invisible. Dr. Ashford did not like invisible people. They challenged the architecture of authority. They made decisions without announcing them. They possessed knowledge that lived in their hands rather than in protocols and papers. They were the kind of people who could, in a moment of crisis, become more valuable than the person with the diploma on the wall. And they needed to be managed. Controlled. Reminded of their place. He'd made a mental note to review her file, to understand who this Laura Bennett was, to determine if she needed to be relocated to another unit or restructured into something less threatening. The hospital was built on the premise that power flowed from the top down. Everyone who worked here understood that. Everyone except, perhaps, the ones who'd learned power in a different context entirely. Dr. Ashford had no idea that Laura Bennett knew how to breach a compound at 3 in the morning. That she'd carried a child out of rubble in Marja and watched that child grow into a soldier. That the scar on her left shoulder was from shrapnel that had come within an inch of severing her brachial artery. That she'd been a senior chief petty officer in special forces before she became a nurse. He only knew that she'd made him feel small in a moment when he needed to feel large. That was enough. The morning shift progressed with its rhythms, medication rounds, vital sign checks, charting updates, patient education. Laura moved through each task with the automaticity of experience, her hand steady, her attention absolute. Room 451's patient woke around 8, asked for water, asked about when he could eat. She checked his orders and explained the imaging results that Dr. Ashford had reviewed: no pneumothorax, no hemothorax, just fluid that the chest tube was managing. He was healing normally. "When can I get out of here?" he asked. His voice was rough from the intubation he'd had in the ER, but his eyes were clear. Alert. Focused. "If the imaging stays clear and your tube keeps draining like this, Dr. Ashford will probably release you tomorrow afternoon," Laura said. "You'll need to follow up with orthopedics for the rib bruising, but that's usually outpatient." He nodded, seeming to accept this. But something flickered in his expression when Laura turned away, something she didn't see because she'd already moved to the next task, the next room, the next patient who needed her attention. She wouldn't have recognized the look anyway. It was the look of someone seeing a ghost. Of someone understanding that the person in scrubs, the person who'd checked his for and documented his vitals with such precise efficiency, was someone he'd known in a different context, a different lifetime, a different part of the world entirely. But he said nothing. And Laura, moving through her shift with the quiet competence that had kept her invisible for 18 months, had no idea that the past was about to collide with her present at terminal velocity. The fluorescent lights hummed. The monitors beeped. The rain continued outside, and in a hospital bed in room for 51, a decorated soldier recognized the gait, the economy of movement, the hands that had pulled him out of rubble 2 decades ago, and understood that his healing was going to become far more complicated than any doctor's chart could predict. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as Laura adjusted the settings for the post-surgical patient in room for 47, her movements economical and precise. The man's wife sat in the corner chair, her hand gripping the armrest. Their adult daughter stood at the bedside, watching the monitors with the kind of intensity that came from not knowing what any of it meant but knowing it mattered. The morning light filtered through the blinds in thin, pale stripes. Laura checked the 4-line, then the medication drip, then the oxygen saturation reading on the wall display, a 97%, stable, good. She'd been doing this for 18 years, and her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that required no thought, just presence. The door opened. Dr. Ashford entered without knocking, reviewing a chart as he walked. He didn't look up from the paper. When he finally spoke, his voice was sharp enough to cut through the quiet like a scalpel through skin. "Nurse Bennett, this charting delay is unacceptable. Do you understand that your incompetence creates liability for this entire hospital?" The wife's eyes widened. The daughter turned from the monitor, confused. Laura turned slowly from the ventilator, her hand still steady, her face absolutely still. Her eyes met his, flat and cold as lake ice in January, the kind of cold that comes from having already seen the worst the world has to offer and decided not to flinch anymore. 3 seconds of silence stretched between them. The fluorescent light above the bed hummed its indifferent hum. Laura's jaw remained loose, her breathing even. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, measured, the kind of quiet that fills a room the way a full glass fills to the brim without spilling. Your need to feel powerful says more about your insecurity than my competence. She turned back to the 4-line without waiting for a response, her fingers resuming their work, adjusting the flow with methodical precision while Ashford's face deepened to crimson. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. For a moment, he stood there, his hands clenched, his breathing audible in the small room. Then he spun and stormed out, the door swinging shut harder than it should. The wife released her grip on the armrest. The daughter exhaled slowly. Laura continued her work as if nothing had happened, her composure a shield that reflected nothing, revealed nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The real punishment wasn't in what Ashford did openly, it was in what he orchestrated in the spaces between moments. The next day, Laura entered the staff break room at 0630 to find a handful of colleagues already gathered, microwaving their breakfasts and preparing for the shift. She moved to her usual corner table at the far end of the room, the quiet spot where she preferred to eat her lunch alone. She'd just sat down, her sandwich opened on the table in front of her, when Sarah Chen, the best ICU nurse on the floor, the woman who'd worked beside her for 4 years, stood up and walked to a different table. Then Marcus Williams gathered his coffee. Then the respiratory therapist. Within 90 seconds, the entire room had migrated, a silent exodus orchestrated by whispers that had already begun circulating through the unit about associating with problem employees and not respecting the chain of command. Laura ate her sandwich. She didn't look up. Her jaw tightened, but the rest of her shoulders, her hands, her breathing, remained as steady as it had been in room for 47. She understood what was happening. She'd seen it before, in different uniforms, in different conflicts. When a leader decided you were a threat, they isolated you first. They made sure no one would stand beside you when the rail strike came. She bit into the bread and chewed, the motion deliberate and unhurried, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her retreat or break. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Friday morning arrived with grey clouds hanging low over Houston, the kind of humidity that made the air feel like water you could breathe. Laura arrived for her shift at 0645 to find a formal written reprimand posted on the unit bulletin board where all staff gathered for shift change. Her name was there in black and white, Laura Bennett. Fabricated policy violations about medication documentation. Alleged failures in patient communication protocols. Language carefully chosen to sound professional, institutional, bureaucratic, each word a calculated lie with the weight of a hospital's official letterhead behind it. She stood before it as colleagues whispered behind her, reading each line while her hands remained at her sides, absolutely still. The words didn't matter. She could see the architecture of it, the careful construction. Documentation doesn't make lies true, but it sure makes them harder to deny. Ashford had created a paper trail. He'd made it official. He'd made it something that could be referenced in board meetings, something that could be shared with lawyers if this ever escalated beyond the hospital walls. She felt someone watching her. She turned. Dr. Ashford stood 10 feet away with his arms crossed, his expression carrying the thin smile of a man who believed he was winning. Laura's voice, when she spoke, was quiet enough that only he could hear it. Documentation doesn't make lies true, doctor. Then she turned and walked back to her patients, her spine straight, her pace unhurried, while he watched her go and began already planning his next move. The smile didn't fade. It only deepened. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure intensified like a vice slowly closing. On Monday, Laura arrived to find the staffing board reorganized. Sarah Chen had been reassigned to the orthopedic recovery unit, not a request, a reassignment, effective immediately. Marcus Williams was being transferred to cardiology. Her two most experienced teammates, the ones who could verify that she knew exactly what she was doing, were gone. Ashford had been methodical about it, making the requests through official channels, citing staffing needs, leaving no obvious fingerprints. But Laura understood the language beneath the language. The schedule changed too. Laura found herself assigned 16-hour double shifts, Tuesday through Thursday, with only 8 hours between them. It was technically legal. It was technically within hospital policy. But it was exhausting in ways that accumulated like sand in an hourglass. By hour 14 of a shift, precision falters. Judgment blurs. That was the point. He was waiting for her to make a mistake while functioning on the edge of human capacity. Access to the medication room was restricted without explanation. Her security code began generating errors. When she tried to draw a 100 micrograms fentanyl dose for a post-operative patient in pain, the system locked. She had to page a supervisor, wait for approval, watch someone else retrieve the medication. The delays weren't huge, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, but delays in an ICU ripple outward. They affect care. They create stress. They generate complaints. She worked around it, never complaining, finding workarounds, but the message was clear: he controlled even the smallest aspects of her job. 3 phone calls happened that week that she didn't hear but felt the consequences of. Ashford called board members on the golf course, in bars, during casual conversations. He mentioned Laura's name with carefully calibrated concern, the kind of concern that sounds like he was protecting the hospital rather than attacking her. Cultural fit issues. Attitude problems. Questions about whether she respected the chain of command. The board members made notes. They mentioned it in their next meeting. That kind of repetition, that kind of institutional attention, had weight. By Wednesday, her direct supervisor, Rita, a floor manager who had worked beside her for years and might have actually defended her, was suddenly reassigned to the orthopedic wing. The new supervisor was a former resident of Ashford's. The new supervisor smiled when Laura entered the ICU, but the smile had teeth. Laura worked. She arrived early, stayed late, performed her duties with the same precision she'd learned 2 decades ago in places where mistakes cost lives. But the vice was tightening. She could feel it. And she understood now that Ashford had weaponized everything: the schedule, the access restrictions, the reassignments, the whispers, the official documentation, because he understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about making sure you had no argument left to make. And then on Wednesday night, the transfer alert came through. A decorated soldier arrived as a critical admission from the VA hospital across town, arriving by ambulance in his own crisis. Tension pneumothorax, a collapsed lung caused by air trapped in the pleural space, the body working against itself, pressure building where it shouldn't. The admission was chaos by design: multiple paramedics, urgent handoff, the ICU team converging in room for 51 with the focused intensity that comes when someone is dying in front of you. Laura moved through it with the muscle memory of someone who had done this hundreds of times, positioning herself without being asked, anticipating what was needed before it was needed, her hands moving on their own while her mind remained absolutely still. The soldier was sedated already, his face obscured by the oxygen mask, his body a series of numbers and readings and crisis points that demanded immediate response. She didn't see his face clearly. Didn't recognize him. Didn't know that the man in the bed before her was someone she'd pulled from rubble 20 years ago in a place called Marja, someone whose survival she'd carried in her chest ever since, someone whose healing was about to become far more complicated than any doctor's chart could possibly predict. What she knew was that his oxygen saturation was dropping and that they had maybe minutes before cardiac arrest would join the list of his problems. And somewhere in that chaos, with Dr. Ashford standing at the edge of the room watching how she moved, how she anticipated, how she operated with the kind of quiet authority that came from actually knowing what she was doing, the real crisis had already begun. It just hadn't reached its peak yet. Monday morning at St. Michael's arrived with the kind of quiet that precedes collapse. Laura walked into the ICU at 6:47 a.m., her worn combat boots leaving wet prints on the tile floor from the Houston rain outside. She touched them in her locker the way she always did, a ritual older than her civilian name, older than these scrubs, and moved toward the nursing station where the shift assignments were posted. The reassignments jumped off the board like detonations. Sarah Chen. Reassigned to cardiac step down. Marcus Williams. Transferred to trauma, effective immediately. James Rodriguez. Moved to pediatrics. All three of them gone. All three of them the nurses who had covered her back during Ashford's escalating campaign, who had eaten lunch with her when others had stopped, who had whispered that his accusations didn't make sense. The reassignment memo was signed at 5:30 a.m., before the hospital fully woke, before anyone could object. Laura stood in front of the posted list for exactly 4 seconds. Her jaw clenched once. Then she turned and began her shift. By Wednesday, the pattern had calcified. Ashford scheduled her for a double shift, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., then 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. A 26-hour rotation that severed her from the normal rhythm of the hospital. She wouldn't overlap with day shift staff who might ask questions. She wouldn't see the nurses she'd worked alongside for 18 years in normal rotations. The isolation was precise, mathematical, weaponized. He was building a perimeter around her, one shift at a time. She worked the first double without complaint, her movements as methodical as a surgical instrument. The 4 lines she placed had the kind of accuracy that came from 4,000 insertions. The wound dressings she changed showed the kind of attention most nurses reserved for patients who were conscious enough to thank them. Pain was information, and her hands moved like they were reading a language everyone else had forgotten. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the kind of monotonous drone that could wear a person down if she let it. Laura didn't let it. Thursday morning at 2 a.m., during the night shift portion of her double, she sat in the break room with a container of cold coffee and watched what happened next. She watched it the way a wildlife photographer watches predators moving through tall grass, with detached precision, noting patterns. The door opened. A nurse named Patricia from day shift grabbed her lunch from the refrigerator. Another nurse, David, walked in behind her. They saw Laura sitting alone at the corner table and something shifted in the air. Not hostility. Worse. Erasure. Patricia turned toward David and began talking about a prescription error on 3 North, her voice pitched specifically to exclude the figure at the corner table. David laughed. They left together, their footsteps moving down the corridor. Then came the exodus. One by one, nurses who had worked alongside Laura for over a decade found reasons to take their lunches elsewhere. The supply room. The chapel. Their cars. The administrative break room. It didn't matter where, anywhere but the table where she sat today. The message was coded but unmistakable, proximity to Laura Bennett was now a liability. She had seen this tactic before, but never in a hospital. She had seen it in forward operating bases where operatives who asked the wrong questions about command decisions suddenly found their equipment went missing, their intel dried up, their fire support conveniently delayed. She had seen it in the Afghan mountains where soldiers who violated the unofficial hierarchy got rotated out to the worst positions. She had seen it in Marja, actually, but that felt like a different lifetime. Here, in Houston, in scrubs instead of body armor, the mechanism was identical. Create distance between the target and potential allies. Make the target visible but untouchable. Make her a cautionary tale that walked upright. The second double shift came Friday. 14 hours on days, 12 hours on nights. Her muscles moved through the routines of patient care with the fluid precision of someone who had stopped questioning whether she was tired. Fatigue was a luxury. Pain was information. Exhaustion was just another vital sign to manage. But Friday afternoon brought the final institutional hammer. Laura arrived at the medication room for her shift change and found the access restricted. Her badge no longer worked. She stood there for approximately 2 seconds, the time it took her brain to process what had happened, and then walked to the nursing station where Derek Patterson, the floor supervisor who had quietly defended her during the first waves of Ashford's campaign, was supposed to be working. Derek wasn't there. His name was no longer on the rotation. A memo dated that morning explained that he had been reassigned to administrative duties effective immediately. Ashford had extracted him from the floor. Now the supervising nurse was Linda Chen, who had already made 3 comments about maintaining professional boundaries and following the chain of command properly. The medication room door remained locked. Laura didn't ask for the access to be restored. She didn't call HR. She didn't document the restriction. Instead, she simply worked around it, using the pharmacy interface system to pull medications under physician orders, legitimate, documented, by the book. Every single action Ashford had performed was legal. Every reassignment had administrative justification. Every restriction had a policy code attached to it. He had constructed a cage out of legitimate institutional levers, and now he was slowly turning them tighter. The room went dead silent when she realized what he had actually accomplished. He wasn't trying to provoke her into making mistakes. He wasn't waiting for her to break protocol so he could document it. He was systematically removing every person who might interfere with the next phase of his plan. He was creating a situation where she would be alone when something important happened. Where there would be no one to say that's not like her, or she saved my life once, or I trust her with mine. She had been outmaneuvered by someone who understood institutional power the way she understood needle decompression, with a kind of clinical precision that came from doing it 100 times before. That was the worst part. Not that he was trying to destroy her, but that he had elevated the campaign beyond emotional sabotage into something architectural. Something that would look perfectly reasonable to any outside observer who examined the documentation. She could feel the walls of the cage closing, but when she looked down, there was nothing actually touching her. Just the slow, systematic removal of every exit route. Saturday night, during the final hours of her double shift, as she was finishing her charting in the early morning darkness when the hospital felt like it was holding its breath, Laura received the text from her son. Nothing about the hospital. Just, "Mom, when are you coming home?" followed by, "I miss you." She read it 3 times and then put the phone away. The cage was complete. What she didn't know, what nobody at St. Michael's had any way of knowing, was that in room for 51, the patient who had arrived 3 days ago in critical condition was beginning to wake. He was beginning to remember fragments of a moment from 20 years ago in Marja when a soldier in body armor had pulled him from rubble, had pressed her hand over a wound and whispered, "I've got you now," had stayed with him until the medevac arrived. He was beginning to realize that the nurse who had moved past his room at 2 in the morning, the one with the precise movements and the military efficiency, the one who had touched her worn boots like they were a prayer, he was beginning to understand that he might be looking at her face right now, every time she checked his vitals. What nobody knew was that the real collision was still coming. And it was going to arrive on a Tuesday night in exactly 47 hours. Tuesday night at 11:47. Alarm screamed from room for 51 like a living thing. Laura's head snapped up from the nurse's station, 2 units away, for rooms down. She was moving before her brain caught up. Her feet found the tile in a rhythm older than memory. Boot. Tile. Boot. Tile. The corridor stretched and compressed simultaneously, that peculiar hospital physics where distance becomes negotiable. She burst through the door to find Chaos wearing a white coat. The decorated soldier, the one whose vitals had been steady at midnight, whose breathing had been even, whose oxygen saturation had been solid at 96%, was now a failing system. His chest rose and fell with the desperate, asymmetrical motion of a man drowning in his own anatomy. Tension pneumothorax. A lung had collapsed. Air was trapped in the pleural space, compressing the other lung, pushing his heart sideways like a boxer fainting. His oxygen saturation was dropping in real time on the monitor. 94. 91. 88. Dr. Ashford stood at the foot of the bed with his tablet clutched against his chest, his mouth open slightly, his eyes locked on the monitors as if they might rearrange themselves if he stared hard enough. Protocol dictated he call radiology for a chest X-ray to confirm. Protocol meant imaging first. Protocol meant documentation. Protocol meant he was standing there, frozen in the calcified amber of hospital hierarchy, while the patient's color turned from ruddy to ash gray. "Get imaging," Ashford said finally, his voice thin and bureaucratic. Stat X-ray to confirm pneumothorax. The resident didn't move. The nurse at the bedside didn't move. They were looking at him, waiting for the next command, waiting for permission to save a life, and every second that passed was a second the patient's oxygen saturation wasn't recovering. 84. 81. The heart monitor's rhythm began to fracture, the intervals between beats stretching like taffy. Laura was already moving. She didn't remember crossing the room. Muscle memory was a lie, it wasn't muscle that remembered. It was something deeper. Bone memory. The kind of certainty that came from having made decisions under fire when the wrong choice meant someone's child didn't come home. She was at the supply cart, her hands finding exactly what they needed without her eyes directing them. 14-gauge needle. Antiseptic wipe. The motion was automatic, practiced, perfect. Bennett, Ashford's voice cracked like old leather. Step back. We need to follow protocol. His exsanguinating oxygen, Laura said. Her voice was level. Clinical. A statement of fact, not an argument. Needle decompression. Now. She didn't wait for permission. Permission was a luxury she'd surrendered in Marja, and the habit had never fully returned to her civilian hands. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her fingers reading the geography of his ribs like braille. One wipe of antiseptic. The needle went in with a soft pop, puncturing the parietal pleura, and then came the sound that meant survival. The hiss. Air escaping. Trap pressure releasing. The room held its breath around that single sound. The patient's chest rose properly for the first time in minutes. His color began its migration back toward human. The oxygen saturation climbed like a ladder. 89. 92. 96. The monitor found its rhythm again, the beep settling into the steady cadence of a body deciding to stay alive. Get a chest tube set up, Laura said to the resident, who jumped as if electrocuted. Call surgery. Tell them we have a tension pneumothorax, decompressed, stable vitals, patient ready for transfer. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the voice of someone who'd spent 12 years making them under conditions that involved actual bullets. The resident scrambled. The nurse moved. The machinery of the hospital responded to certainty the way it never responded to hierarchy alone. The soldier's eyes fluttered open. They found Laura's face. Something ancient passed across his pupils, recognition that hadn't arrived yet but was on its way, a memory trying to claw through the morphine and trauma. Chief. His voice was barely audible. The morphine was fighting his attempt to stay conscious. His eyelids were already falling again, pulling him back under. How did you? Laura was already turning away. She didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice. She was reaching for the chart when she caught Ashford's expression, and she recognized in that moment the precise instant when his humiliation transformed into something uglier. His face was the color of spoiled meat. His hands were trembling around his tablet like a man holding something that might explode. He was no longer trying to break her. He was trying to bury her. Within 60 minutes, 3 phone calls had been made. The hospital administrator's emergency line at 1 o'clock in the morning, unusual enough to raise eyebrows. The chief of medicine at 1:45, Ashford's voice tight and urgent, citing patient safety violations and unauthorized invasive procedures. The hospital attorney at 2, the conversation longer, more technical, more lawyerly. Papers would need to be filed. Documentation would need to be unassailable. A narrative needed to be constructed where the nurse who'd saved a life was transformed into a liability. By 2:30, Ashford had pulled the surveillance footage. The camera above room 451's entrance had captured everything in perfect, damning clarity. A nurse moving without waiting for orders. A needle being inserted without verbal confirmation from the attending physician. A procedure being performed, an invasive procedure, an interventional procedure, a procedure that carried risk, by someone without authorization to perform it. By 6 in the morning, the incident report was filed. Formal. Meticulous. Devastating in its clinical precision. Laura Bennett had performed an unauthorized needle decompression without obtaining explicit physician approval. This constituted a violation of Hospital Protocol 7.4.2 regarding scope of practice and physician supervision requirements. Patient safety had been compromised by deviation from established chains of command, regardless of outcome. The outcome didn't matter. Outcomes never mattered in bureaucratic equations. Only process mattered. Only the paperwork. Only the record. By 9 o'clock, her access had been restricted. All patient rooms locked to her credentials. All medication dispensary access denied pending investigation. The floor supervisor who'd witnessed the entire sequence, who could have testified that the procedure had saved the patient's life, had been reassigned to the pediatric wing. A convenient transfer. A management decision. A silencing executed with the same precision Ashford brought to everything he did. At 9:15, Laura received a message on her phone. Report to Dr. Ashford's office. Immediately. An HR representative will be present. She knew what was coming before she opened the door. The room had been arranged with the careful staging of an execution. Ashford behind his desk, papers in neat stacks. The HR representative, a woman named Patterson whose sympathy was written across her face like an apology, sitting to his left with a folder containing paperwork that had already been signed, already been decided, already been made irreversible. Ms. Bennett, Ashford began, and his voice was gentle now, almost regretful, the tone of a man removing a bullet from someone he was pretending to care about. Your pattern of insubordination and violation of hospital protocols has created an untenable patient safety environment. Last night's incident, while well-intentioned, represents a fundamental breach of the physician-nurse collaborative model that this institution depends on. Laura stood with her hands at her sides. She didn't sit. She didn't ask for a chair. Her face was a closed door, and behind it she was traveling backward in time, to Marja, to the compound, to the moment she'd pulled a 6-year-old boy from rubble while bullets sketched geometry through the air around her. That boy had a name now. He had a uniform. He had a SEAL team and a future. But Ashford didn't know that. Ashford would never know that. Ashford only knew that his authority had been questioned, and authority, once questioned, demanded vengeance. Your employment is terminated effective immediately, he continued. The words were bureaucratic, precise, final. He slid the paperwork across his desk with the reverence of someone offering a treaty. Termination notice. Final paycheck calculation. Health insurance continuation information. A severance agreement that required her signature in 3 places. Laura read it once. Her eyes moved across the letters without registering them individually, the way a person reads a text they've already memorized. She didn't sign. She didn't argue. She simply folded the papers and tucked them into her scrub pocket. I need to finish my charting, she said. Her voice was absolutely flat. For the patient in 451. Security will escort you from the building, Patterson said softly, as if gentleness could make the execution less fatal. Your access has been disabled. You can collect your personal items from your locker. Laura turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, Ashford was speaking again, something about the decision being final, about the board support, about the regrettable necessity of maintaining institutional protocols. His voice became smaller as she walked, a diminishing frequency, a sound that mattered less with every step away. The locker room was empty. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, between shifts, between lives. She opened locker 73 and found her life arranged on a single shelf. A coffee mug with her son's face on it. A stethoscope, the good one, the one she'd bought herself. A photograph of Daniel at his high school graduation, his smile the only thing in the world that still felt real. She packed them into a cardboard box someone handed her without asking questions. The boots, the worn combat boots from Marja, the ones she touched every shift for luck, the ones that held memory in their creases, she left in the locker. She couldn't carry them. Not yet. not with her hands occupied with the fragility of a life she was supposed to be rebuilding. The security guard who escorted her out was a man named Marcus who'd worked the night shift for 4 years. He didn't speak. He just walked behind her, an echo of authority, a reminder that she no longer belonged here. When they reached the parking lot, the Houston heat rose from the asphalt in waves that made the horizon shimmer like a mirage. Her car was where she'd left it. Her life was where she'd left it. Nothing had changed in the physical world. Only in the bureaucratic one. Only on the paperwork. At midnight, she found herself in the hospital laundry room. She hadn't planned to come back. Her feet had simply carried her there while her mind was elsewhere, and when she looked up, she was standing beneath the fluorescent lights that hummed with the same indifferent frequency they always had, as if continuity meant something. As if permanence was possible. On the folding table in front of her lay her uniform, the scrub she'd worn for the past 8 hours before security had walked her out, before the doors had closed behind her, before everything had ended. The cotton was soft between her fingers. She picked up the top, held it at the shoulders, and began to fold it the way she'd folded a flag at Arlington, the way she'd folded flags for 12 years, the way precision had always mattered more than survival. Each crease exact. Each corner aligned. The bottom hem folded twice. The sleeves brought inward with mathematical precision. When she was finished, it was no longer a uniform. It was a memory. She placed it in the return bin and folded the next piece. Then the next. Her hands moved with the same certainty they'd moved to locate the needle in room for 51, the same certainty they'd moved to comfort the 6-year-old in Marja, the same certainty they'd moved in every moment since she'd learned that precision was the only control you got in a world intent on chaos. The bin was full. She walked out carrying the cardboard box containing the fragments of her civilian life, and didn't look back at the lights. The dismissal paperwork slid across Dr. Ashford's desk like a death sentence, crisp and sterile and final. Laura didn't touch it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her jaw a single hard line, while Ashford's voice carried the bureaucratic precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his bathroom mirror for days. Protocol violations. Patient safety concerns. Unauthorized procedure. The words fell like surgical instruments, meant to cut with institutional authority rather than raw emotion. An HR representative sat 3 feet to her left, legally present and professionally silent, her pen poised above her own documentation. Laura had heard worse from Taliban interrogators with actual bullets in their hands. She listened with the same cold, flat stare she'd given to Ashford weeks ago in that patient's room. When he finished, she stood. She didn't sign anything. She didn't protest. She picked up the box of her personal items from the floor, the box she'd prepared that morning, knowing this was coming, and walked out of his office while he was still holding his pen, still waiting for a reaction that would never come. The fluorescent lights buzzed in the hospital's basement laundry room at 12:47 a.m. Laura worked alone, the way she always did best, moving through the mechanical rhythm of sorting and folding with the same muscle memory that had carried her through 20 years of combat deployments. The scrubs were dark blue, faded at the seams from 100 washings, and they smelled like industrial detergent and the ghost of countless shifts, the 13-hour stretches where she'd held catheters steady and coached terrified family members through the final minutes of a loved one's life. One by one, she folded them with surgical precision, the way she'd once folded flags at military funerals, each crease sharp enough to cut. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed even. This was compartmentalization, the skill that had kept her alive in Marja when shrapnel took out half her convoy. You sealed off the part of you that felt. You kept working. You moved forward. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent goodbye as she placed the final folded pile into the return bin, and when she turned to leave, there was no hesitation, no looking back at the empty locker rooms or the equipment that had been her entire civilian life for the past 18 years. But that wasn't the worst part. Laura was walking to her car with the cardboard box balanced against her hip when she heard the footsteps, fast, urgent, the sound of someone running through the parking lot at nearly 1 in the morning. Her son Daniel burst through the emergency exit, gasping, his 17-year-old frame moving with the kind of desperate energy that made her mother's instinct override everything else. He was holding something. A shadow box. The same shadow box she'd hidden in the attic 18 months ago, wrapped in army-issue canvas and sealed with tape because some things were too dangerous to keep visible. Laura's breath caught. Not because she was afraid, but because the past she'd buried was about to become a very present problem. Daniel's voice came out in urgent fragments. "Mom, they need to see these. The Veteran Memorial. At St. Michael's. It's tomorrow. It's tonight now, actually, but it's at the chapel. You need to come. They need to know. They need to see this." The chapel at St. Michael's was crowded by 1 a.m. with an unusual collection of staff. The chaplain had called an emergency memorial service for another veteran, a patient who died earlier that week, and word had spread through the hospital's night shift the way these things always do. Nurses and respiratory therapists and trauma surgeons stood in small clusters near the polished wooden pews, their scrubs rumpled, their eyes tired. Laura stood at the back, the cardboard box still in Daniel's hands, and she felt the weight of every decision she'd made to keep her identity buried. Then the soldier from room 451 stepped forward in his hospital gown, the one whose lungs she'd saved with nothing but a 14-gauge needle and the certainty that stopping wasn't an option. His chest was still taped from the procedure. His voice was unsteady. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. The room didn't go silent immediately. It went silent the way a building goes silent when the power cuts out, a sudden absence of everything that had been there before. Daniel opened the shadow box with trembling hands, and the medals caught the chapel's soft lighting, ribbons in colors that told a story of sacrifice and fire and decisions made in the dark. A Navy Cross. Purple hearts. A bronze star with the V for Valor. Photographs of a younger Laura in desert camouflage, her face harder than, marked by things that couldn't be unseen. Her military discharge papers, the ones that explained the limp she'd carried for 3 years before the surgery finally helped. One of the nurses, Sarah Chen, the one Ashford had reassigned months ago specifically to break Laura's isolation, pulled up a file on her phone with shaking fingers. Senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett, she read aloud, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Deployed to Marja, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. Operation Mountain Shadow. Extraction of 12 civilians from active combat zone under heavy fire. Direct action raid that dismantled the insurgent network controlling. Sarah stopped. Her eyes were wet. "Why didn't you tell us?" A man in a Navy service dress uniform stepped forward from the back of the chapel, his insignia marking him as a commander, his presence carrying the weight of 20-plus years of active service. This was the soldiers' team leader, visiting from Virginia for the memorial. His voice came out steady and precise. Navy Cross for extracting 12 civilians under fire. He paused. The medals were laid out now, each one getting its own moment, its own acknowledgement. Purple Heart. Bronze Star with Valor. Another pause. The commander's eyes found Laura's across the chapel. And a Navy Cross. The silence after that wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of realization, the moment when everyone understood they'd been standing next to someone they didn't recognize, judging someone they couldn't possibly understand, dismissing a person whose choices had cost her everything. Laura stood with her hands at her sides, her shoulders squared, her breathing controlled. This was the moment she'd spent 18 years avoiding. This was the moment the past became undeniable. An FBI liaison stood up from her seat near the chaplain. She'd been attending the memorial service for another reason entirely. There was an ongoing investigation into the hospital's handling of veteran patients, and now she looked directly at Laura. Senior Chief Bennett's actions in Marja dismantled an insurgent network that saved an estimated 300 coalition lives. The liaison's voice carried the weight of official documentation. 300. Dr. Ashford had been standing near the chapel entrance since the soldier spoke those first words. Laura watched his face change, the confidence draining like water from a cup, the color leaving his skin until he looked like something that had never been quite real in the first place. He backed toward the exit, his jaw working silently, his hands coming up and then dropping back to his sides. He'd spent 6 months building his case against her, dismantling her career, weaponizing protocol and institutional power the way other men wielded guns. He'd done it all to a senior chief petty officer, to a woman who'd carried intelligence documents through Marja while shrapnel sang around her head. He'd done it to someone who'd pulled a child from rubble 20 years ago and watched that child grow into the soldier now standing in a hospital chapel in a gown, with tears in his eyes, finally speaking the name of the person who'd saved his life. The chapel doors closed behind Ashford as he left. Nobody moved to follow him. Nobody even acknowledged his exit. All of them were looking at Laura, the woman they'd watched suffer in silence, the nurse they'd watched Ashford isolate and humiliate, the person they'd judged as difficult or attitude-prone or not quite worthy of their professional respect. And now they were seeing her for the first time. The meditation on what she actually was. Laura's hands moved to her sides, then back to her pockets. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence in that chapel, the absolute, crystalline silence, was louder than any explanation could ever be. Outside, the Houston night was thick with moisture and the smell of rain coming, the kind of tropical humidity that collects in April when the season is turning. Inside the chapel, there was only the sound of people understanding that they had been profoundly, dangerously wrong about someone who had been quietly extraordinary all along. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Laura had learned that lesson in Marja. She was watching the people around her learn it now. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment below with your thoughts. Have you ever been completely wrong about someone you underestimated? What would you have done in Laura's position? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.